The rain began just as the Ashford carriage pulled into the cobblestone courtyard of the Grantwell Inn. It was a cold, sharp autumn rain, the kind that promised to wash away the last remnants of summer warmth and leave nothing but freezing mud in its wake. Emma Cavendish, Duchess of Ashford, sat inside the velvet-lined carriage, her gloved hands resting perfectly still on her lap. She wore a deep navy traveling dress tailored to absolute perfection, and a pair of delicate silk slippers. No woman in her position ever dressed for a storm. She was supposed to be insulated from the elements, protected by wealth, by title, and by the man sitting across from her. James Ashford looked out the rain-streaked window, his jaw tight. He had barely spoken 3 words to her since they left London. His silver pocket watch ticked rhythmically in the quiet cabin, a sharp contrast to the heavy, suffocating silence between them. The carriage rolled to a halt. Thomas, the loyal footman who had served the Ashford family for 30 years, opened the door and offered his hand. Emma took it, preparing to step down into the damp air for a brief respite. But before her silk slipper could touch the ground, a voice cut through the courtyard. "James! Good heavens, what a stroke of luck!" Emma's breathing stopped, just for a fraction of a second. It was a visceral, involuntary reaction that she instantly forced back under control. Standing beneath the awning of the inn, untouched by the rain, was Vivienne Marcourt. She wore a deep emerald green riding habit that perfectly accentuated her narrow, striking features. Her raven hair was flawlessly pinned, and her piercing blue eyes were locked entirely on James. She did not even glance at Emma. James stepped out of the carriage immediately, ignoring the rain spotting his tailored dark wool coat. "Vivienne," he said. His voice, which had been cold and clipped for the past 3 hours, suddenly carried a warmth that made Emma's chest tighten. "What are you doing stranded here?" "Me hired coach broke an axle 2 miles back," Vivienne said, stepping closer to him, her voice a masterclass in calculated distress. "The innkeeper says there won't be another transport until tomorrow morning, and I am expected at Harwick Manor by nightfall." Emma remained seated in the carriage, her nails pressed half moons into the palms of her leather gloves. She knew about Vivienne. The whispered rumors, the late nights, the lingering scent of gardenias on James's coats. She had endured it with the silent dignity required of a woman of her station. But Vivienne had never been this bold. She had never deliberately orchestrated a collision in public until now. James turned back to the carriage. He looked at Emma. His gray eyes were flat, devoid of the affection that had once existed there a decade ago. "Emma," he said, clearing his throat. The tone was not a request. It was an administrative order. "Miss Marcourt has found herself in a rather difficult situation." Emma looked at him. She did not speak. "The carriage is entirely full with your trunks," James continued, refusing to meet her gaze directly. "There is no room for 3 inside. It would only be decent to offer her your seat." The courtyard went dead silent. Thomas, standing by the open door, froze. 2 maids carrying linens paused on the inn steps. A stable boy stopped brushing a horse. Everyone heard it. The Duke of Ashford was publicly asking his wife to surrender her carriage to his mistress. "I see," Emma said softly. Her voice did not waver. It was smooth, cold, and devastatingly polite. "And how do you propose I reach Harwick Manor?" James shifted his weight, uncomfortable but resolute. "The innkeeper can arrange a local cart for you once the storm passes. It is only 5 miles to the next crossing. You will be perfectly fine. You always manage. You always manage." The words felt like a physical blow. Her endurance had become a weapon used against her. Because she never screamed, because she never threw tantrums, he assumed she felt nothing. Vivienne stepped forward, her face the perfect picture of fox sympathy. "Oh, Your Grace, I could not possibly ask you to stay behind. It is raining so dreadfully." Yet she made no move to step back. She stood waiting, claiming the space. Emma looked from Vivienne's polished, triumphant eyes to James's impatient frown. She could refuse. She could cause a scene, scream at him, demand her rights. She could weep. But tears would mean she was broken, and Emma Cavendish was not broken. "Very well," Emma said. She did not wait for Thomas to assist her. She stood, lifted the hem of her navy dress, and stepped out of the carriage. The moment her feet hit the ground, the cold, freezing mud soaked through the thin soles of her silk slippers. The physical shock was immediate, sending a sharp ache up her calves. But her face remained a mask of absolute composure. "Emma," James started, perhaps finally catching the severe wrongness of the image before him. His wife standing in the mud, while another woman took her dry seat. "Do not concern yourself, James," Emma said, her voice dropping the temperature of the air around them. "I will handle my own arrangements." Thomas reached out, his hand trembling slightly. "My lady, please, let me find you a cloak at least." "No, Thomas," she said quietly. "Close the door." Thomas hesitated, his jaw clenched in quiet outrage on her behalf, but he obeyed. As the heavy door swung shut, Emma saw Vivian settling into the velvet cushions. Through the oval glass window, the mistress offered Emma a small, unmistakable smile of pure victory. The driver cracked the whip, the horses pulled forward. The carriage wheels churned the mud, splashing the hem of Emma's dress as it rolled away, leaving her standing entirely alone in the pouring rain. She did not run to the inn for shelter. She did not look around at the pitying stares of the maids or the stable boy. Emma pulled her gloves tighter. She turned her back to the inn, faced the long, grey stretch of the country road, and began to walk, one step, then another. The rain plastered her dark hair to her cheeks. The silk slippers tore against the sharp gravel within the first 100 yards. Her feet were freezing, atching with every footfall, the mud dragging heavily at her skirts. 5 miles. It was a ridiculous, impossible distance for a woman dressed for a drawing room. But she did not stop. She did not cry. As the cold seeped into her bones, something else took root in her chest. The quiet, desperate wife who had tried to save a dead marriage was left behind in the mud of the courtyard. The woman walking down the road was entirely different. She was an aristocrat who had just been handed her freedom in the cruelest way possible, and she realized with a terrifying, icy calm that she held a secret James Ashford had completely forgotten. She owned Hawick Manor, and it was time to take it back. The first mile was a matter of shock. The English country road, typically a picturesque route of rolling green hills, had transformed into a jagged, treacherous path of loose gravel and deep, freezing mud. Emma's silk slippers, designed to glide across polished marble floors and thick Persian rugs, offered absolutely no protection. Within 20 minutes, the delicate fabric had shredded against the sharp stones. The rain did not yield. It fell in heavy, gray sheets, plastering her dark brown hair to her cheeks and soaking through the heavy velvet of her deep navy traveling dress. The fabric, once an elegant armor of wealth, now weighed her down like a drenched shroud, the hem caked thick with freezing brown sludge. Every step required calculated effort. Every footfall sent a sharp, brilliant ache up her calves. Yet Emma Cavendish kept her spine perfectly straight. Her wide, set hazel eyes remained fixed on the horizon. She did not shiver, though her skin was pale as marble. She did not cry, though the cold bit into her bones with a physical cruelty. By the second mile, the physical pain in her bleeding heels began to recede, replaced by a profound, terrifying clarity. For 10 years, she had been the perfect Duchess of Ashford. She had managed James's estate. She had balanced the ledgers, orchestrated the social seasons, and smoothed over his careless mistakes with the quiet efficiency expected of a woman of her pedigree. She had endured his growing distance. She had endured the whispers in the drawing rooms. She had even endured the scent of Vivienne Marquardt's gardenia perfume clinging to his lapels. Endurance, Emma had been taught, was the highest aristocratic virtue. A lady did not scream, a lady did not break. But as the icy rain washed away the last traces of her marital loyalty, Emma realized she had been enduring for a ghost. James was not a man who had lost his way. He was a man who had willingly handed the reins of his life to a social climber. And Vivienne had not just wanted the Duke. She wanted Hawick Manor. Emma's breath plumed in the freezing air as her mind turned to the cream-colored document locked away in a hidden vault. Hawick Manor did not belong to the Ashford estate. It belonged to Margaret Cavendish, Emma's late mother, who had left it explicitly to her daughter in a deed signed 20 years ago. The Ashford solicitors had never formally filed it, a convenient oversight orchestrated by James's late father. 3 weeks ago, Emma had discovered the unthinkable. Vivienne, manipulating James's blind trust, had bribed a clerk in the solicitor's office. She had submitted a forged legal letter, bearing Emma's perfectly replicated signature. Relinquishing all of Emma's claims to the Hawick land, Vivienne was quietly building an alternative legal claim, preparing to steal the estate right out from under them, while playing the devoted mistress Emma had known. She had held the proof of the forgery in her hands, and she had said nothing. She had kept the secret, bearing the burden of it in absolute silence, waiting for one thing, a sign that James was merely a fool, not an accomplice. She had waited for a moment of grace, a sliver of proof that the man she married would ultimately protect her when the wolves circled. Instead, he had looked at her in the pouring rain and told her to give her dry carriage seat to the wolf. The third mile brought the wind. It whipped across the open fields, biting through her soaked bodice. Her feet were numb now, the ruined silk ribbons of her slippers dragging in the mud. She could feel the warm trickle of blood mixing with the freezing puddles beneath her soles. But Emma felt no despair. The heavy, suffocating weight she had carried for the past 2 years, the anxiety of trying to save a dying marriage, was suddenly gone. She had been cast out of the carriage, yes, but she was finally free of the burden of managing James Ashford. Halfway through the 4th mile, the distinct sound of iron-rimmed wheels and heavy hooves echoed over the drumming rain. A carriage was approaching from behind. Emma did not stop walking. She did not turn her head. If it was a local farmer, she would politely decline a ride. If it was a passing merchant, she would step aside. She would not be the tragic, abandoned wife begging for charity on the side of a dirt road. She moved toward the edge of the path, keeping her chin high, waiting for the vehicle to pass. It did not pass. The heavy coach slowed, the magnificent black horses coming to a halt directly beside her. It was not a hired cart. It was a massive, uncrested carriage painted a deep, lustrous burgundy. It radiated an expensive, untouchable silence. The heavy door swung open. Sitting in the dim, dry warmth of the velvet interior was a man with sharp gray eyes, immaculate white hair, and an expression composed of lethal stillness. He rested both hands on the silver head of his walking cane. Lord Edmund Cavendish, her mother's brother, the silent architect of her family's wealth. He did not look shocked. Lord Cavendish was never shocked, but as his sharp eyes took in Emma's soaked hair, her freezing, pale face, and the mud ruined hem of her dress, a dangerous darkness flickered across his features. "I had anticipated many foolish things from James Ashford," Cavendish said, his voice a low, smooth baritone that barely carried over the rain. "But I did not anticipate he would be suicidal." Emma stood in the rain, looking at the only man in England who truly understood the power her mother had left behind. Her throat tightened. For a fraction of a second, the exhaustion threatened to break her composure. "Get in, Emma," Cavendish said softly. She stepped up into the carriage. The warmth of the cabin wrapped around her freezing body like a physical shield. The door snapped shut, instantly cutting off the roar of the storm outside. Emma sank into the opposite leather seat. She did not lean back. She sat perfectly straight, looking down at her ruined silk slippers, the blood and mud staining the luxurious floorboards of her uncle's coach. "He gave her my seat," Emma said. Her voice was barely more than a whisper, but it was completely devoid of tears. It was hollow, scraped clean of all remaining affection. "I know," Cavendish replied, handing her a thick, dry-wool blanket. "I have had men watching Vivienne Marcourt's movements for a month. I knew she was stranded. I merely waited to see how James would handle the inconvenience." Emma wrapped the blanket tightly around her shivering shoulders. "I am done managing him, uncle." Cavendish's gray eyes locked onto hers, holding a terrifying level of aristocratic calm. "I assume, then, you are ready to use the document." Emma looked up. The coldness in her hazel eyes matched his perfectly. The quiet, enduring Duchess was dead, left behind on the muddy road. "I am not just going to use it," Emma said, her voice dropped into a sharp, icy register. "I am going to let them sit in my dining room, drink my wine, and celebrate their victory. And then I am going to take the very floor beneath their feet." The carriage ride lasted an hour, moving smoothly away from the main road and deep into the forested hills where the storm seemed to lose its edge. When they finally stopped, it was not at a grand estate, but outside a heavy stone cottage hidden behind a wrought iron gate. It was one of Lord Cavendish's private retreats, a place built for absolute discretion and silence. Emma stepped down from the carriage. The mud on her ruined navy dress had begun to dry into a stiff, freezing crust. When her torn silk slippers touched the stone steps of the cottage, they left faint, watery traces of red. Cavendish saw the blood. His jaw tightened, the muscles ticking beneath his pale skin, but he said nothing. He did not offer pity. Aristocrats did not insult each other with pity. They offered solutions. Within the hour, the physical remnants of Emma's humiliation were stripped away. The mud-caked dress was taken by Mrs. Hale, the fiercely loyal housekeeper, to be burned. Emma was bathed in scalding water that drove the chill from her bones, her blistered and bleeding heels carefully bandaged. When she finally entered Cavendish's private study, she was a different woman. She wore a borrowed dress, a simple, heavy black velvet gown with a high, austere collar. Her dark brown hair, washed free of the rain, was pinned back with severe precision. The physical exhaustion remained in the faint shadows beneath her hazel eyes, but her posture was flawless. The cold, expensive stillness had fully settled over her. The study smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and ink. Lord Cavendish sat behind a massive oak desk. 2 crystal glasses of amber sherry poured, though neither of them reached for a drink. Between them on the polished wood lay 2 folders. Vivienne Marcourt is an ambitious woman? Cavendish said, his voice a smooth, dangerous murmur, but her ambition far exceeds her intellect. She mistook my retirement to the country for a lack of attention. Emma walked gracefully to the desk. Her bandaged feet made no sound on the thick rug. She looked down at the first folder. She bribed a junior clerk in the Ashford solicitor's office. Cavendish continued. A terrified young man named Dowell. He was paid a substantial sum to quietly log a letter relinquishing your rights to Hawick Manor and to bypass the senior partners. He has been sweating through his suits for a month. Cavendish tapped the folder. I paid him double to write a full confession. He signed it yesterday. Emma did not touch the confession. Her eyes moved to the second folder. It was older. The leather cracked at the spine. The forgery, Cavendish said quietly, was remarkably well done. She had acquired a sample of your correspondence. The loop of the E, the strict angle of the A. To an untrained eye, or a husband who was not looking closely, it was indistinguishable from your own hand. James never looks closely, Emma said. Her voice was flat. He sees what is comfortable to see. A wife who asks for nothing, and a mistress who tells him he is brilliant. He saw the signature, assumed I was stepping aside to preserve the peace, and asked no further questions. He allowed her to handle the legal transition of the land, Cavendish said. She is currently building a framework to transfer the Hawick deed entirely into her own name, using his authority and your supposed surrender bird. Emma finally reached out. Her pale fingers, completely steady, touched the cracked leather of the second folder. But she cannot steal what James does not own, Emma whispered. No, Cavendish agreed. She cannot. He opened the folder. Inside was a single, thick piece of cream-colored parchment. It was 20 years old. The edges were slightly yellowed, the wax seal at the bottom heavy and dark. It was the original deed to Hawick Manor, drafted by the Cavendish lawyers and held in secret trust. At the bottom of the page was a signature, bold, elegant, and uncompromising. Margaret Cavendish. Emma let her fingertips rest against her mother's name. A phantom warmth seemed to rise from the dried ink. Her mother had known. Even 2 decades ago, Margaret Cavendish had understood the fragility of an aristocratic marriage. She had known that a title was nothing but heir. But land was undeniable power. She had locked Hawick Manor away in a legal fortress, waiting for the day her daughter might need it. That day was today. If this document is presented, Irma asked softly, her eyes tracing the legal phrasing, what happens to Vivienne's claim? It turns to dust, Cavendish said simply. The forged letter becomes a criminal offense. Her property maneuvers collapse, and James Ashford will be forced to explain to the highest courts in England how he allowed his mistress to attempt the theft of a ducal estate. Cavendish leaned back, the firelight catching the sharp planes of his face. James and Vivienne arrived at Hawick Manor 3 hours ago. The staff reports that James told the guests you were indisposed and had returned to London. They are preparing for tomorrow night's grand banquet. 30 of the most influential peers in the country will be seated at that table. Emma closed her eyes for a brief moment. She pictured the grand dining room of Hawick Manor, the heavy oak table, the crystal chandeliers, the roaring fires. She pictured Vivienne wearing emerald silk, sitting near the head of the table, smiling, playing the gracious hostess, believing she had finally won the war. She pictured James holding a glass of wine, secure in his arrogance, convinced that his quiet wife was miles away, weeping in the dark. Pain used to live in Emma's chest. Now there was only the cold, precise machinery of justice. She opened her eyes. The hazel depths were like frozen earth. Let them prepare the banquet, Emma said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. Let her wear her best jewels. Let her pour the wine and smile at the guests. She picked up the yellowed cream-colored document. The paper felt heavy, loaded with 20 years of silent authority. I will not return to London, Emma said. Tomorrow night, I will walk through the front doors of Hawick Manor. I will not scream, and I will not weep. She looked at Lord Cavendish, her face a flawless mask of aristocratic execution. I am going to let them raise their glasses. And then I am going to drop this file on the table and watch them choke. Hawick Manor was a sprawling, limestone beast of an estate, built 3 centuries ago to project absolute power. It had 60 rooms, vaulted ceilings, and corridors so long that footsteps echoed like distant thunder. It was a house that demanded management. Without a firm, invisible hand guiding the army of servants, the grandeur quickly curdled into cold, drafty chaos. For 10 years, Emma had been that invisible hand. James Ashford sat in the heavy leather chair behind the desk in the Harwick Library, staring at the unlit fireplace. It was the evening after the storm, 24 hours since he had watched his wife step down into the mud at Grantwell Inn. He had expected to feel a sense of relief. The suffocating tension of the carriage ride was gone. He was free to enjoy the weekend with Vivienne without the quiet, judging presence of his wife. Yet as the hours ticked by, the relief never materialized. Instead, the manor felt profoundly, uncomfortably hollow. Small things were wrong. The tea brought to his study was tepid, the silver tray slightly tarnished. The fire in the drawing room had smoked earlier, forcing the guests to relocate. At dinner the previous night, the floral arrangements had been asymmetrical, blocking the sightlines across the table. James had never noticed these details before, because they had never existed before. Emma had always moved through his life like a ghost, quietly adjusting the temperature of his world, so he never had to feel the cold. Now, the ghost was gone and the chill was creeping in. The heavy mahogany door opened, breaking his train of thought. Vivienne Marcourt stepped into the library. She wore a stunning evening gown of deep emerald silk, her dark hair woven with pearls. She looked every inch the Duchess she intended to become. But as she moved across the Persian rug, James noticed, for the very first time, a slight sharpness to her smile, a predatory edge that he had previously mistaken for devotion. "Sitting in the dark, darling?" Vivienne asked, her voice a velvet purr. She moved to the crystal decanters on the side table and poured him a glass of scotch. "Just thinking," James murmured, taking the glass she offered. Vivienne circled behind his chair, resting her hands lightly on his shoulders. Her gardenia perfume, usually intoxicating, suddenly smelled overpowering in the enclosed space of the library. "The guests are settling in beautifully," she said, her fingers massaging the tense muscles of his neck. "Bertram's mother was asking after Emma. I told her the damp air had aggravated her constitution, and she had prudently returned to London." Everyone was terribly sympathetic. James took a slow sip of the scotch. It burned the back of his throat. Yes, well, it was for the best. Vivienne leaned down, her cheek brushing against his. "It is for the best, James. We finally have a moment to breathe and to plan." She paused, her fingers stilling on his collar. "Speaking of planning, I received a wire from my solicitor this morning. Now that Emma is safely out of the picture, and she has, of course, surrendered her rights to the Harwick borders, my men are ready to finalize the transfer of the estate deeds into my name." "As we agreed." James frowned. He lowered the glass. "There is no rush, Vivienne," he said. "Oh, but there is," she insisted, stepping around the chair to face him. Her blue eyes were bright, a little too eager. "The legal season closes in a month. If we do not file the Harwick papers now, the land could be tied up in probate courts for another year. It is merely a formality, James. Just need your final authorization to instruct the clerks." James looked at her, really looked at her. For 2 years, Vivienne had been his sanctuary, a woman who praised his intellect, who made no demands, who seemed entirely devoted to his happiness. But standing here in the dim light of the library, pushing him to sign away ducal lands less than 24 hours after he had humiliated his wife on a dirt road, she looked different. She looked like a woman who was closing a business transaction. "I said there is no rush," James repeated. His voice carried the sudden, sharp authority of a duke. Vivienne's smile faltered. A flash of genuine irritation crossed her features before she quickly masked it with polished affection. "Of course, darling. Whenever you are ready." She smoothed the front of her emerald gown. "I must go check on the seating arrangements for tomorrow's banquet. Do not stay in here too long." She glided out of the room, closing the door softly behind her. James exhaled, running a hand over his face. He felt a sudden, inexplicable tightening in his chest. He tried to shake it off. Emma was fine. She always managed. She had probably hired a comfortable cart, spent the night at a respectable inn, and was already back in their London townhouse, drinking hot tea. The door opened again. This time it was Thomas. The gray-haired footman carried a brass bucket of coal, his face a mask of professional neutrality. He moved to the fireplace and knelt, beginning to build the fire that should have been lit an hour ago. James watched him. The silence in the room stretched, thick and uneasy. "Thomas!" James said. The footman paused, the iron tongs resting in his gloved hand. "Yes, your grace?" "When Lady Ashford left the Grantwell Inn yesterday." James hesitated, suddenly loathing the sound of his own voice. "The innkeeper found her a suitable cart quickly, I assume, before the worst of the storm broke." Thomas did not look at him. He placed a lump of coal onto the grate with deliberate precision. "I cannot say, Your Grace," Thomas replied, his voice perfectly level. "What do you mean you cannot say? Did you not see her off?" Thomas set the tongs down on the stone hearth. He stood up slowly, turning to face the Duke. The footman had served James's father. He had known James since he was a boy. And in Thomas's eyes, James saw a profound, devastating disappointment. "Her Grace did not wait for a cart, my lord," Thomas said quietly. James, "What?" "The innkeeper informed us that all horses were occupied. There would be no transport until morning." Thomas clasped his hands behind his back. "When I offered to find her a cloak, she refused. She instructed me to close the carriage door." The glass of scotch in James's hand tilted, the amber liquid threatening to spill over the crystal rim. His pulse began to hammer against his ribs. "Then how did she leave?" James demanded, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Your Grace," Thomas said, the words falling like stones into the quiet room, in her silk slippers. "She turned toward the north road, and she walked into the rain, and she did not look back." The crystal glass slipped from James Ashford's hand. He caught it just before it tipped over completely, slamming it down onto the mahogany desk with a sharp, violent crack. The amber liquid sloshed over the rim, staining the polished wood, but James did not notice. "Walked," James repeated. The word felt foreign on his tongue, sharp and jagged. "Yes, Your Grace," Thomas said, not stepping back, not breaking eye contact. James stared at the footman, his mind struggling to process the image. The north road out of Grantwell was notorious for its rough terrain. It was unpaved, scattered with sharp flint, and highly prone to flooding. He thought of the heavy, freezing downpour. He thought of the deep, churning mud. And then he thought of Emma's shoes, delicate, thin-soled silk slippers held together by a few ribbons, designed only for stepping from carpet to carriage. 5 miles, James said, his voice hollowing out in a storm. "Why did you not stop her? Why did you not insist she wait inside the inn?" "I am a footman, my lord," Thomas replied quietly. "I do not command the Duchess of Ashford, especially not when her husband has just publicly commanded her to surrender her seat to another woman." The truth hit James like a physical blow to the chest. He stepped back, the back of his knees hitting the leather chair. He collapsed into it, suddenly robbed of his breath. "She did not weep, Your Grace," Thomas continued, his voice devoid of pity, acting only as a relentless mirror to James's sins. "She did not complain. She simply lifted her skirts and stepped into the mud. I watched her walk until she disappeared into the rain. And I must tell you, my lord, she did not look like a woman who was defeated." James looked up, his grey eyes wide, fractured. "What did she look like?" Thomas paused. He adjusted his white gloves, choosing his words with the careful precision of a man who had seen decades of aristocratic follies. "She looked like a woman who had finally been given permission to stop trying." Thomas bowed slightly. "I will finish seeing to the fires, Your Grace." The footman turned and left the library, pulling the heavy oak door shut. The click of the latch echoed in the cavernous room like the ceiling of a tomb. James was entirely alone. He reached instinctively for his silver pocket watch, pulling it from his waistcoat. The rhythmic ticking, which usually grounded him, now sounded like a countdown. He opened the cover. It was 8 o'clock in the evening. 24 hours ago, Emma had been on that road. Where was she now? Was she safe? Was she ill? The thought of her pale, shivering, her feet bleeding on the gravel, sent a surge of genuine, nose-eating horror through his veins. He had done that. He had not struck her. He had not physically pushed her. But he had opened the carriage door and let the elements tear her apart, so he wouldn't have to deal with Vivian's complaining. He had chosen the path of least resistance, and the cost was his wife's dignity. But Emma had not surrendered her dignity. She had taken it with her, leaving him with nothing but his own shame. James stood up abruptly, unable to remain still. He paced the length of the library, the dark walls suddenly feeling tight and suffocating. Vivian's words from mere minutes ago floated back into his mind. "She has, of course, surrendered her rights to Harwick Borders. My men are ready to finalize the transfer." James stopped pacing. He stared at the massive portrait of his late father hanging above the mantel. Emma's mother, Margaret Cavendish, had been a formidable woman. Emma revered her memory. She took immaculate care of everything connected to the Cavendish name. Why, then, would Emma quietly surrender a massive parcel of Cavendish land to the Ashford estate, and by extension, to Vivian Marcourt? Without a single conversation, without a fight, James moved swiftly back to the desk. He pulled open the heavy bottom drawer where his solicitor had forwarded the recent estate files. He sifted through the thick parchment folders until he found the one marked Hawick boundary resolution. He threw it onto the desk and opened it. There, resting on top of the legal jargon, was the letter Vivienne had referenced, a formal statement relinquishing all of Emma's ancestral claims to the disputed Hawick borders, clearing the path for Vivienne's legitimate purchase of the land. At the bottom of the page was Emma's signature. James leaned over the desk, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows across the paper. He studied the ink. The elegant, sloping E, the sharp, definitive cross in her title. It looked perfect. It looked exactly like the signature on the household ledgers and the dinner invitations. But James Ashford, for all his careless arrogance, had spent 10 years living with Emma. He knew her quiet habits. He knew she pressed the nib of her pen down heavily when she finished a signature, leaving a tiny, darker pool of ink at the very end of the final stroke. It was a subconscious mark of finality. He stared at the signature on the legal document. The ink was perfectly, uniformly smooth. The final stroke tapered off lightly, elegantly. It was a flawless copy, but it lacked the heavy, definitive pressure of his wife's hand. James's blood turned to ice. He looked toward the library door, thinking of Vivienne upstairs in her emerald silk gown, smiling, pouring drinks, arranging the seating for tomorrow's grand banquet. The legal season closes in a month. If we do not file the Hawick papers now, the land could be tied up. I just need your final authorization. Vivienne wasn't looking for peace. She was looking for a signature to legitimize a theft. She had orchestrated the collision at the Grantwell Inn to humiliate Emma, to drive her away, and to ensure she was not present when the final transfer was executed. And James, blinded by his own comfort and flattered by a mistress's attention, had practically handed her the keys to his estate. He had traded a duchess for a thief. James slowly closed the file. The quiet, empty library seemed to close in around him, the silence roaring in his ears. He did not know the woman he had been sharing a bed with, but more terrifyingly, he realized he had vastly underestimated the woman he had abandoned in the rain. If Emma knew about this, and James suddenly, with absolute certainty, knew that she did, she would not simply retreat to London to weep. She was a Cavendish. Tomorrow night was the Hawick banquet. 30 of the most powerful peers in England would be sitting at his table. James looked at the closed oak door. The feeling of impending dread washed over him, heavy and cold as a winter storm. He had a terrible, sinking realization that his wife was not missing at all. She was merely waiting. The Hawick dining room was a theater of wealth, designed specifically to overwhelm the senses and demand submission. 30 of the most influential peers in England sat along the massive length of the polished oak table. Above them, 3 cascading crystal chandeliers from the 18th century cast a brilliant, warm golden light over the heavy silver cutlery and the fragile porcelain. The air was thick with the scent of roasted venison, expensive claret, and the quiet, steady hum of aristocratic power. At the center of it all was Vivienne Marcourt. She wore the deep emerald silk gown, the fabric catching the chandelier light with every calculated movement. She sat near the head of the table, a position that heavily implied her impending permanence in the Ashford household. She was holding court, laughing at a joke made by the Earl of Sussex, her blue eyes bright with the intoxicating thrill of victory. She had orchestrated the perfect scandal, eliminated the quiet wife, and was now mere days away from securing the Hawick deed. To her, the room was not just a dinner party, it was her coronation. At the actual head of the table sat James Ashford. He looked like a man attending his own execution. He had not touched his wine. His plate of venison remained untouched. His tailored evening coat felt suffocatingly tight across his broad shoulders. Every time Vivienne laughed, a cold spike of revulsion drove itself deeper into his stomach. He had spent the entire day paralyzed by the revelation of the forged signature. He had not confronted her yet, held back by a terrifying, paralyzing certainty that if he moved, if he tipped his hand, whatever Emma had planned would strike him blindly. James knew his wife. Emma did not retreat. If she had walked 5 miles in the mud to get away from him, it was only to find solid ground from which to return fire. The dinner progressed to the second course. The low hum of conversation filled the vast room. The string quartet played softly from the upper gallery. Then the music stopped. It did not fade out gracefully. The violinists simply ceased playing mid-note, their bows dropping as their eyes fixed on the entrance. The sudden absence of music rippled through the room. One by one, the lords and ladies lowered their silver forks. The laughter died in throats. The hum of conversation evaporated into a heavy, suffocating silence. James felt the temperature in the room plummet. He slowly turned his head toward the entrance. The massive, double oak doors at the end of the hall were wide open. Thomas, the gray-haired footman, stood at the threshold. He did not bang his staff. He did not announce the arrival with the booming voice usually reserved for formal entrances. There was no need. Thomas simply took a step back, pressed his white, gloved hands to his sides, and executed a bow deeper and more profoundly respectful than any he had ever given the Duke himself. Emma Cavendish stepped into the light. There was no trace of the ruined, mud-stained woman who had been cast out in the freezing rain 4 hours ago. The bedraggled navy traveling dress was gone. The ruined silk slippers were gone. She wore black velvet. The gown was impeccably tailored, boasting a high, severe collar that framed her pale face like a portrait of cold, untouchable vengeance. Her dark brown hair was swept back and pinned with terrifying precision, leaving her sharp, delicate jawline completely exposed. She wore no diamonds. She wore no pearls. Her sheer unadorned presence was far more expensive than any gem in the room. She did not look angry. She did not look heartbroken. Her wide, set hazel eyes were entirely composed, radiating an expensive, lethal stillness that instantly drained the oxygen from the dining room. James stood up. The legs of his heavy wooden chair scraped violently against the stone floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. His hands gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. His heart hammered against his ribs. Vivienne, seated just to his right, froze. Her polished smile shattered. For a fraction of a second, raw, unfiltered panic flared in her piercing blue eyes. She gripped the stem of her wineglass so tightly it threatened to snap. But Vivienne was a survivor, built on calculated audacity. She forced her lungs to expand, her mind scrambling to salvage the narrative she had so carefully constructed. She stood up, smoothing the front of her emerald gown, projecting the false warmth of a gracious hostess. "Emma." "Your Grace," Vivienne called out, her voice echoing slightly in the dead, silent hall. "Good heavens, we were told you were indisposed and had returned to London to recover. You must be absolutely exhausted from traveling in this weather." Vivienne stepped slightly away from her chair, offering a sympathetic, condescending smile to the audience of peers. "Let me have the servants draw a bath for you. You really should not exert yourself." Emma did not stop walking. She did not blink. She did not change her expression. She simply continued her slow, measured, graceful walk down the length of the dining room. She treated Vivienne Marcourt with the ultimate aristocratic cruelty total, absolute erasure. She did not look at the mistress. She did not react to her voice. She walked past Vivienne as if the woman in the emerald silk was nothing more than an unpleasant draught of air. Vivienne's mouth clamped shut, her cheeks flushing a dark, humiliated crimson. She was left standing awkwardly by her chair, dismissed not with a scream or a slap, but with a silence so profound it was humiliating. The guests watched in horrified fascination. No one dared to speak. No one dared to breathe too loudly. They parted their gazes as Emma passed, unable to meet the freezing depths of her hazel eyes. Emma stopped at the opposite end of the long table, directly facing James. The physical distance between them was 20 feet of polished oak, silver, and crystal. But the emotional chasm was infinite. James looked at the woman he had married 10 years ago. He looked at the woman he had abandoned in the mud. He saw the sheer, terrifying force of her dignity. And for the first time in his life, the Duke of Ashford felt entirely powerless. "James," Emma said. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It was smooth, steady, and cut through the silence like a scalpel through silk. James swallowed over the dry lump in his throat. His aristocratic authority had completely dissolved. "Emma," he breathed, his voice barely a rasp. Emma rested one pale, ungloved hand on the polished surface of the table. She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the gathered elite with supreme, unbothered calm. "I must apologize to our guests for my tardy arrival," Emma said, her tone the epitome of polite, high society grace, though the undercurrent of ice made the hairs on the back of James's neck stand up. "There was a matter of severely mismanaged property that required my immediate attention, but rest assured, I have come to set the house in order." The stillness in the dining room was absolute, heavy with the kind of tension that precedes a violent storm. 30 of England's most elite aristocrats remained frozen in their seats. No one reached for their wine. No one dared to whisper. They were witnessing the total, catastrophic collapse of a ducal marriage, and none of them could look away. James Ashford stood at the head of the table, his knuckles white where he gripped the polished oak. His heart was hammering a frantic, desperate rhythm against his ribs. The sight of Emma, standing at the opposite end of the room in black velvet, untouched by the rain and unbroken by his cruelty, paralyzed him. "Emma," James said, his voice raw, stripped of all its usual aristocratic polish. "Please, not here. Let us retire to the library. We can discuss this in private." Emma's wide-set hazel eyes shifted to him. The look she gave him was not hateful, it was worse. It was the look one gives a stranger who has asked an unreasonable question. "There is no privacy in a house that has been stolen, James," she said, her voice echoing softly against the vaulted ceiling. "And you chose the public square yesterday afternoon when you asked me to step into the mud before half the staff of the Grantwell Inn. I am merely accommodating your preference for an audience." A collective, silent gasp rippled through the guests. The Earl of Sussex, seated near the centre, slowly lowered his fork to his plate, his eyes darting between the Duke and Duchess. The whispers would fuel London drawing rooms for a decade. Vivienne Marcourt could feel the room turning against her. The intoxicating aura of power she had reveled in just minutes ago was evaporating into thin air. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles stark white against the emerald silk of her gown. Vivienne said, forcing a tone of concerned urgency. She looked at the guests, attempting to paint Emma as hysterical. "She is clearly unwell. The trauma of the storm has affected her nerves. You must have the servants escort her upstairs before she embarrasses herself further. Be quiet." The command cracked through the room like a whip. It did not come from Emma. It came from James. He did not look at Vivienne. He kept his horrified, fractured gaze locked entirely on his wife. The sharpness of his tone, the absolute disgust bleeding through those two words, struck Vivienne like a physical blow. She sank back into her heavy wooden chair, the color draining completely from her narrow face. Emma did not react to James's defense. It was 24 hours too late, and it meant nothing to her now. She turned her head slightly. Thomas, the gray-haired footman, stepped forward from the shadows of the doorway. He carried a silver tray, a tray traditionally used to present calling cards or formal correspondence to the Duke. But Thomas did not walk toward James. He walked the length of the long table, passing Vivienne without a glance, and stopped directly beside Emma. He bowed deeply and presented the tray to the Duchess. Resting on the gleaming silver was a cracked, dark leather portfolio. The visual shift of power was devastating. The Ashford staff had publicly chosen their master, and it was not the man sitting at the head of the table. Emma picked up the portfolio. Her pale hands were entirely steady. She untied the leather string and opened the flap. 20 years ago, Emma began, her voice taking on a hypnotic, rhythmic cadence as she withdrew a thick, cream-colored parchment. "My mother, Margaret Cavendish, anticipated that the men of this family might one day confuse marriage with absolute ownership. She was a pragmatic woman, and so she placed the deed to the Hawick lands into a secret trust." Emma held the document. The heavy, dark wax seal dangled from the bottom edge, catching the golden light of the chandeliers. "This estate was never a part of the Ashford entailment," Emma said, walking slowly down the right side of the table, her black velvet skirt whispering against the stone floor. "It was never James's to manage, and it certainly was never his to give away." James closed his eyes. The shame was a physical weight, pressing him down into the floorboards. He knew this. He had learned it this morning. But hearing it spoken aloud, seeing the yellowed parchment in her hands, cemented his failure in the eyes of his peers. Emma stopped walking. She was standing directly behind Vivienne's chair. Vivienne stiffened, her spine rigid, her breathing shallow and rapid. She stared straight ahead, terrified to look up at the woman standing over her shoulder. 3 weeks ago, Emma continued, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly intimate register, a letter was filed with the Ashford solicitors. A letter bearing my signature, conveniently surrendering my ancestral rights to this very estate. A necessary precursor, I imagine, to a quiet transfer of property into the hands of a new claimant. The dining room was dead silent. The guests were aristocrats. They understood the lethal implications of land theft. Eyes turned toward Vivienne, filled with sudden, cold disgust. Emma reached into the leather portfolio and pulled out a second piece of paper. It was crisp, white, and newly folded. "You are wearing a beautiful gown tonight, Miss Marcourt," Emma said softly, looking down at the emerald silk. "But you possess a remarkably clumsy hand for forgery." Vivienne choked on a breath. "That is a lie," she whispered, her voice trembling, stripped of all its former velvet. "James, she is lying." Emma dropped the crisp white paper onto the table, right next to Vivien's untouched wine glass. A sworn signed confession from a clerk named Dowell, Emma stated, her voice slicing through Vivien's pathetic defense. He details exactly how much he was paid by a woman in a dark cloak to bypass the senior partners and log a fraudulent document, a document designed to steal a ducal estate. Emma leaned down slightly, her face inches from Vivien's ear. The scent of rain and cold velvet overpowered the sickening sweetness of gardenia. You thought because I did not scream, I did not know how to fight, Emma whispered, her tone carrying the absolute, freezing weight of the Cavendish bloodline. But my family does not fight, Miss Marcourt. We simply take back what is ours. Emma straightened up. She took the yellowed, original deed to Harwick Manor and dropped it squarely onto the center of the polished oak table. The heavy wax seal hit the wood with a sharp, definitive thud. This house, Emma said, looking across the length of the table at her broken husband, the ground beneath your feet, the roof over your heads, belongs entirely to me. The echo of the heavy wax seal hitting the oak table lingered in the air, a final, definitive strike of the gavel. 30 guests, the absolute pinnacle of English high society, sat in stunned, breathless fascination. They were individuals who traded in secrets and scandals, who understood the intricate, unforgiving machinery of power, and they understood instantly what had just occurred. Vivienne Marcourt had not merely engaged in a scandalous affair, she had committed a severe criminal offense. Forgery of a ducal property deed was a crime that carried catastrophic legal consequences. The social temperature in the room shifted with terrifying speed. To the aristocratic elite, adultery was a distasteful but common parlor game. Land theft, however, was an unforgivable sin. The Earl of Sussex, who had been laughing warmly at Vivienne's jokes just 10 minutes prior, slowly shifted his chair, angling his shoulders completely away from her. The woman seated across from Vivienne meticulously pulled her silk shawl tighter around her arms, looking at the mistress with an expression of pure, unadulterated revulsion. Vivienne Marcourt was suddenly absolutely isolated. She stared at the white paper on the table, the confession that had just annihilated 3 years of careful, meticulous planning. The emerald silk gown, which had felt like a queen's armor an hour ago, now felt like a heavy, suffocating shroud. Jamie's, Vivienne gasped. Her voice was thin, fractured, stripped of the velvet purse she had perfected. She looked toward the head of the table. James, you must listen to me. This is a fabrication. She has paid this clerk to frame me out of sheer jealousy. You know me. You know I would never. Do not insult my intelligence, Vivienne. James's voice was barely a whisper, yet it carried the chilling, hollow ring of a man who had just realized he was standing on the edge of a cliff. He did not look at her with anger. He looked at her with a profound, horrified disgust. He had spent the last 2 years protecting her. He had humiliated his wife for her. And in return, Vivienne had forged a legal document that would have inexorably tied the Ashford name to a criminal fraud. If the courts had discovered the theft of the Cavendish land after the transfer, James would have been indicted alongside her. She had planned to use his title as a shield, willing to drag his entire lineage into the mud to secure her own wealth. You forged my wife's signature, James said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. You bribed a clerk in my own solicitor's office. You orchestrated a theft that would have ruined my family name permanently. I did it for us, Vivienne cried, her composure finally shattering. The polished social climber vanished, leaving behind a desperate, cornered animal. Her hands gripped the edge of the oak table. She was suffocating you. The land was disputed. It was a mess of paperwork. I was only trying to secure it so we could finally be free of her shadow. Emma's voice cut through the air, cool and sharp as cracked ice. Vivienne flinched, her eyes darting back to the woman in black velvet. Emma had not moved. She stood with absolute, terrifying stillness looking down at the mistress. She did not raise her voice. The aristocratic silence was far more effective than any scream. You did not want freedom, Miss Marcourt, Emma said softly, her hazel eyes completely devoid of mercy. You wanted a title that you did not earn, and land that you could not afford. You looked at my quietness and mistook it for weakness, a common fatal error for those unaccustomed to true power. Vivienne opened her mouth, her chest heaving, but no words came out. The crushing weight of the room's collective disdain pinned her to the spot. She looked around the long table. 30 faces, aristocratic and cold, stared back at her with open contempt. There would be no salvation here. By tomorrow morning, every drawing room in London would know her as a fraud, a thief, and a disgraced exile. Her social credit was not just bankrupt, it was annihilated. Emma turned her gaze away from Vivienne, dismissing her entirely from her consciousness. She looked toward the heavy oak doors. "Thomas!" Emma commanded softly. The gray-haired footman stepped forward, his posture rigid with absolute loyalty to the Duchess. "Yes, Your Grace. Have the footman pack Miss Marcourt's trunks immediately," Emma instructed, her tone as casual as if she were ordering tea. "Have the secondary carriage brought around to the front steps. She will not be spending the night under my roof." Vivienne staggered back from the table, her face chalk white. "It is pouring rain," she whispered, her voice shaking with disbelief and terror. "It is pitch black outside. You cannot throw me out into the night." Emma finally turned her head, fixing Vivienne with a look of pure, unadulterated ice. "I walked 5 miles in the freezing mud, wearing silk slippers because you desired my carriage seat," Emma said, smoothly, every word striking like a hammer blow. "I am providing you with a dry coach to the nearest railway station. You should consider it an act of extraordinary, unmerited grace. Now, remove yourself from my dining room." The command was absolute. There was no room for debate, no space for negotiation. Vivienne looked one last time at James. He had turned his face away, staring blankly at the fireplace, refusing to even acknowledge her existence. He had washed his hands of her, trembling, her emerald silk rustling loudly in the suffocating silence of the hall. Vivienne Marcourt took a step back. She turned on her heel and began the long, agonizing walk toward the double oak doors. It was the longest walk of her life. No one spoke. No one offered a sympathetic glance. The only sound in the massive dining room was the rapid, uneven click of her heels against the stone floor. She passed the elite lords and ladies who had humored her ambitions just an hour ago, completely stripped of her dignity, her legal standing, and her future. As Vivienne crossed the threshold and disappeared into the darkened corridor, Thomas stepped forward and pulled the heavy double doors shut with a resounding final thud. The immediate threat was gone, excised from the house like an infection. But the tension in the room did not dissipate. It merely shifted focus. The Earl of Sussex cleared his throat softly, breaking the profound silence. He stood up, placing his linen napkin on the table. "Your Grace," he said, bowing deeply to Emma, not James, "it has been an eventful evening. I believe it is best if we retire to our quarters and allow you to attend to your private affairs." One by one, the 30 guests stood. They bowed and curtsied to Emma Cavendish, acknowledging the true power in the room, completely ignoring the broken man sitting at the head of the table. Within minutes, the grand dining room was emptied of its audience. The crystal chandeliers burned brightly. The fire cracked in the hearth. Emma stood at one end of the long oak table, her hand resting near the yellowed deed. James sat at the other end, his world entirely destroyed by his own hubris. The mistress was gone. The audience was gone. Now the husband would have to pay the toll. The heavy double doors of the dining room remained firmly shut. The grand space, which just an hour ago had hummed with the orchestrated power of the English aristocracy, was now a cavern of devastating silence. The crystal chandeliers still burned brightly, casting long, golden reflections across the polished oak table. But the warmth had entirely vanished. At the far end of the room, Emma Cavendish stood completely still. Her hand rested lightly beside the yellow-deed Harwick Manor, her high-collared black velvet gown blending into the shadows of the room. She was a portrait of absolute, untouchable calm. At the head of the table, James Ashford remained in his chair. He looked at the empty seats, the half-filled wine glasses, the crumpled linen napkins abandoned by peers who had fled his sinking ship. Finally, his eyes drifted down the length of the table to the woman he had married, the woman he had completely failed to see for a decade. Slowly, James stood up. His legs felt heavy, as if the physical weight of his aristocratic title had suddenly been replaced by the crushing gravity of his own disgrace. He stepped away from the head of the table, the seat of the master, and began to walk toward her. He did not walk with the easy, careless confidence that had defined his life. His shoulders were bowed. His gray eyes, usually so assured and dismissive, were wide fractured and brimming with the agonizing realization of what he had destroyed. He stopped 5 feet away from her. The distance felt unbridgeable, James said. His voice cracked. It was a raw, deeply human sound, entirely stripped of his ducal armor. "I am sorry." Emma did not flinch. She did not soften. Her wide, set hazel eyes regarded him with the terrifying, clinical detachment of a judge viewing a closed case. "I know you are James," she replied, her voice smooth and quiet. "No, I was blind." James choked out, taking a half step forward, his hands trembling at his sides. I let my vanity and my comfort blind me to what was happening in my own house. I allowed her to poison my perception of you. But when Thomas told me, when he told me what you did, James swallowed hard, his throat tight with genuine agony. When he told me you walked 5 miles in the freezing rain, in those silk slippers, Emma, the thought of you on that muddy road, alone, while I sat in the dry carriage, it has been tearing me apart from the inside. I will never forgive myself. He reached out, his hand hovering in the space between them, a desperate plea for connection. Please, let me make amends. Let me spend the rest of my life proving that I can be the husband you deserved from the very beginning. Do not throw 12 years away. Emma looked at his trembling hand. She felt a faint, distant echo of mourning in her chest. A brief, passing grief for the young woman who had once loved him, but that was all it was. An echo. The fire had been thoroughly drowned out by the rain. She took a single, deliberate step back, removing herself entirely from his reach. You misunderstand the situation, James, Emma said, her tone carrying the chilling perfection of falling snow. I am not throwing 12 years away. I am simply acknowledging that you gave them away, and you sold them for a very cheap price. James lowered his hand, his face pale as a ghost. You did not just give Vivian my carriage seat. Emma continued, her words precise and merciless. You gave her my dignity. You gave her my home. You handed over my peace of mind, and you expected me to manage the inconvenience quietly, as I always managed everything else for you. I was a fool. James whispered, a tear finally breaking loose and tracing a hot path down his cheek. Emma, I am begging you. Give me a chance to fix it. You cannot fix a death, James. James froze, his breath hitching in his chest. The woman who would have forgiven you, Emma explained, her voice dropping to a quiet, devastating murmur. The devoted wife who would have endured your arrogance, smoothed over your scandals, and waited endlessly for you to realize her worth. She died on the North Road out of Grantwell. The cold killed her. The mud buried her. Emma picked up the yellowed parchment from the table. She held the original deed to Harwick Manor, the physical manifestation of her restored power. I am what walked out of the rain, she said, her hazel eyes locking onto his with absolute, freezing finality. And I am no longer yours to command, to overlook, or to betray. James stared at her, the reality of his loss crashing down on him with the force of a collapsing building. There would be no redemption. There would be no second act. He had broken the one foundation in his life that he had assumed was unbreakable, and now he was left with nothing but ruins. This is my estate, Emma stated, her voice shifting back to the polite, administrative tone of a duchess giving orders to a subordinate. You are permitted to stay the night in the east guest wing. The storm makes travel unsafe. Tomorrow morning you will return to your London townhouse. My solicitors will contact yours regarding the formal separation of our assets. Emma, please. It was a pathetic broken sound. The Duke of Ashford, begging in his own dining room. But Emma was already turning away. She did not offer a final word of cruelty. She did not need to. Her revenge was not built on vengeance or violence. It was built on truth, and truth was the heaviest weapon of all. Emma walked toward the grand double doors. The heavy black velvet of her gown whispered against the stone floor, a soft, expensive sound that commanded the silence of the room. Thomas, standing at the ready in the shadows, stepped forward and pulled the heavy oak doors open for her. She stepped across the threshold, walking out into the brightly lit corridor of the estate she now owned outright. She did not look back. The heavy doors closed with a solid, echoing thud, sealing the dining room. James Ashford was left entirely alone in the massive, silent hall. The golden light of the crystal chandeliers beat down on the empty chairs, the abandoned wine glasses, and the vast, echoing space where his life had once been. He stood in the center of the room, listening to the deafening silence, finally realizing the true cost of a 5-mile walk in the rain.